There are movies you watch, and then there are movies that quietly rewrite the rules of an entire decade. Pretty Woman is one of those films. Released in March 1990, it became something that nobody, not the studio, not the director, not even Julia Roberts herself, saw coming. Over 30 years later, it still trends on Google every single Valentine's season, still pulls viewers back in for a rewatch, and still sparks debates about love, money, and what a fairy tale is actually allowed to look like. But here's the thing. Everything you think you know about Pretty Woman? It's barely the surface. Behind every glittering frame of that film were moments the studio wanted buried. Secrets a cast never planned to share. Accidents that nearly derailed the entire production. And decisions made quietly, desperately, sometimes in a panic, that ended up defining one of the most iconic love stories Hollywood has ever produced. Some of these stories have only recently started coming back to the surface through old interviews, crew testimonies, and archive deep dives that fans have been obsessing over online. And once you know them, you will never watch Pretty Woman the same way again. Let's start somewhere most people don't expect. Not with Julia Roberts' smile or Richard Gere's silver hair, but with a script that had nothing to do with romance whatsoever. Before Pretty Woman had its title, before it had its ending, before it had any trace of a fairy tale in it at all, it was a brutal little film called $3,000. Written by J.F. Lawton, the original script was set in the same neon-lit Los Angeles, but the world it painted was nothing like the one audiences would eventually fall in love with. Vivian wasn't witty or warm. She was a woman fighting addiction, surviving predation, and navigating a city that had already decided she didn't matter. Edward wasn't charming or emotionally unavailable. He was cold, transactional, and he liked it that way. The week they spent together ended exactly how you'd expect a business transaction to end. He paid. She left. That was it. No rescue. No roses. No climbing up any fire escapes. When Disney acquired the rights to that script, the studio didn't just tweak it. They detonated it and rebuilt it from the ground up. The mandate, reportedly delivered with zero ambiguity, was to strip out the darkness and replace it with electricity. What they got was something that had never quite existed before in Hollywood, a romantic comedy with genuine edge, dressed up in the costume of a Cinderella story. And while most people celebrate that transformation, what often gets lost in the telling is just how much of the original truth was buried to make it happen. There are scenes from that darker version that were actually filmed, and then quietly pulled from every cut and locked away. Footage of Vivian in her apartment, sitting with a flicker of TV light across her face and crumpled cash on the table beside her, exists somewhere in Disney's archives. Test audiences in 1989 who saw an early version of the film described it as emotionally devastating. That version, the one Lawton actually wrote, never made it to a single public theater. Now here's something that's been searched and discussed heavily in recent years, especially as conversations around Hollywood's treatment of women have intensified. Julia Roberts almost didn't survive Disney's rewrite either. When the studio took over the project, executives began expressing doubts about her. She was 21 years old. She hadn't yet become the Julia Roberts the world would know. And in their eyes, that was a problem. Internal memos, later referenced in interviews with people who were present during pre-production, suggested that the studio wanted someone safer, someone whose image was already curated and controlled. Names like Meg Ryan, Daryl Hannah, and Michelle Pfeiffer circulated. There were real weeks during which Julia Roberts was, by all accounts, no longer attached to the film. What kept her in it was Gere Marshall. The director had seen something in her during auditions that executives were too busy second-guessing to notice. He described it as an ability to make tragedy feel warm, to carry pain behind a smile without letting the smile become a lie. He reportedly refused to accept the replacement conversation and told the studio in very direct terms that removing her would cost them the movie. He was right, of course. But Roberts didn't know she'd been saved. By the time filming began, she was carrying the full weight of knowing she'd already been almost fired once. And that pressure had a physical effect on her that the cameras inadvertently caught in the most beautiful ways. Crew members who worked on the set have spoken in interviews about what it was actually like to watch Julia Roberts prepare for a scene. The trembling, the shallow breathing just before action was called, the moments when she'd grip a prop with both hands just to keep steady. Her makeup artist has recalled needing to redo her lipstick between nearly every emotionally charged take because her lips would quiver uncontrollably right up until the camera rolled. During one of the early love scenes, her pulse was visibly racing, blood vessels showing at her forehead. And Gary Marshall stopped the entire production, sat beside her on the set, and just talked. Not about the scene, not about the shot. He cracked jokes. He told stories. He waited until she breathed again. What happened next is one of the most quietly extraordinary things about Pretty Woman. That anxiety, all of it, every tremor and every flash of raw fear, translated on film into exactly the kind of vulnerability that made audiences fall completely in love with Vivian Ward. The nervousness became innocence. The shaking became softness. The terror of a 21-year-old woman who'd already been told she wasn't good enough for the role she was playing became the emotional core of one of the most beloved characters in modern cinema. None of it was acting. It was survival, and it was magnificent. Then there's Richard Gere, and this part of the story gets surprisingly overlooked every time Pretty Woman comes up. Gere wanted absolutely nothing to do with the film. He read the script, likely one of the earlier, lighter rewrites, and dismissed it as shallow that he turned it down multiple times. He was a serious actor with a serious reputation, and a glossy romantic comedy about a man who pays for companionship did not fit the image he'd spent years building. What changed his mind is a detail that has genuinely gone viral in recent months, as people rediscover behind-the-scenes stories about the film. It was a post-it note. Gary Marshall arranged a casual meeting between Gere and Roberts at a New York hotel. As the meeting wound down and Gere was clearly heading toward another polite decline, Roberts scribbled something on a small piece of paper and slid it across the table. It read, "Please say yes." Gere has said in interviews that when Hell looked at her in that moment, he felt something he couldn't explain and couldn't ignore, that he called Marshall within the hour. He was in. What fewer people know is that once Gere committed, he brought something to the role that was never in any version of the script. The quiet piano melody he plays in the hotel suite during one of the film's most tender scenes. That wasn't written by anyone. Gere composed it himself the night before filming that sequence. He's been a musician his entire life, and rather than reach for something theatrical, he sat down and played something private. The melody you hear in that scene came directly out of him, unrehearsed and unscripted, on the morning they shot it. And yet, even while filming, even while delivering one of the most charming performances of the decade, Gere has spoken candidly about feeling uncomfortable with what the story was celebrating. The wealth, the power imbalance, the idea that money and a transformation montage could paper over something that was, at its roots, deeply unequal. He called it a beautiful fantasy, and he meant both words. Some of the most searched behind-the-scenes moments from Pretty Woman in recent years involve specific scenes that people have only recently learned the full story behind. The necklace scene is one of them. That moment, Julia Roberts leaning in to admire the jewelry case, Richard Gere snapping it shut, her gasp, and then her uncontrollable laughter, has been watched millions of times. People reference it constantly when they talk about on-screen chemistry, about what makes a romantic moment feel real. And the reason it feels real is because it was. The snap was Gere's idea, encouraged by Marshall, and Roberts had no warning it was coming. Her reaction was pure shock followed by pure joy. The crew laughed. Marshall called it immediately. That was the take. What makes that moment even more extraordinary is what was happening just off camera the entire time it was being filmed. The necklace was not a prop. It was a genuine Fred Jolier piece valued at over $250,000, and it had been sent to the set under the watch of two armed guards who did not take their eyes off it for a single second of filming. Every time Gere held that box, a jeweler's representative was crouched just outside the frame, watching. If it had fallen during that impulsive snap, if the prank had gone even slightly wrong, the production would have been halted and the studio would have been facing a $250,000 problem. Instead, it became one of cinema's most replayed seconds. The line between disaster and magic, it turns out, is sometimes about a millimeter. The physical chaos on set extended well beyond that one scene. The driving sequences, where Vivian takes the wheel of Edward's Lotus with the wind in her hair and joy on her face, were apparently a source of genuine anxiety for the entire crew. Roberts, by her own admission, during rehearsals, barely knew how to drive. Marshall wanted authenticity, which meant real streets and a real car rather than a controlled studio setup. What followed was a series of takes during which she stalled repeatedly, jumped curbs, and a tone point came close enough to a parked limousine that crew members stationed off-camera were prepared to intervene. The car itself carries its own story. Porsche and Ferrari had both declined to lend vehicles to a film they felt had subject matter that might reflect poorly on their brands. Lotus, at the time a company in need of a boost, said yes. After Pretty Woman became a phenomenon, Lotus reported a significant spike in global sales. Being the car in the fairy tale turned out to be worth more than protecting a reputation that didn't need protecting. And then there is the red dress. Few costume decisions in Hollywood history have been searched, debated, and celebrated as much as the choice to put Julia Roberts in scarlet for the opera scene. What almost nobody knows is that the dress was very nearly black. The studio pushed hard for black, safer, more classic, more in line with the polished image they were constructing around the film. Costume designer Marilyn Vance pushed back just as hard. She argued that black would make Vivian disappear, that the whole emotional architecture of that scene depended on Vivian commanding the room rather than blending into it. The debate went on for a week. Screen tests were done with both options. The red won, and when the camera captured Roberts descending that staircase in the night of filming, the crew reportedly went silent watching the monitor. The red dress didn't just dress a character. It announced her. What tied all of these threads together? The anxiety, the unscripted moments, the near disasters, the battles over color and image and tone, was an ending that almost didn't Texas either. The original script had no balcony, no white limousine. No, she rescues him right back. Edward left. Vivian watched him go. The story ended in a silence that said everything about what transactions actually cost. Multiple revised versions tried softer alternatives, ambiguous endings, open roads, unresolved glances, and every single one of them tested poorly. Audiences didn't want reality. They wanted the feeling that something real had been transformed into something better. Gary Marshall wrote the final ending alone, in his office, on a blank notepad. He pitched it to the cast the next morning. Roberts cried when she heard it, and that ending, built overnight from scratch, tested against every version that came before it, shaped by everything the cast and crew had survived together, became the one that the world has never stopped returning to. Pretty Woman grossed $464 million worldwide. Julia Roberts won a Golden Globe, earned her second Academy Award nomination, and became the highest-paid actress in Hollywood before she turned 23. In Japan, fans lined up outside theaters dressed as Vivian. The red dress drove spikes in fashion sales across Europe. The film didn't just succeed, it rewrote the genre and set Adam plate that romantic comedies spent the entire next decade trying to match. But now you know what it cost to get there. The script that had to be dismantled and rebuilt. The actress who was fired before filming began and had to hold herself together through every single take. The director who protected her by shielding her from the very executives who tried to replace her. The unscripted moments, a snap of a jewelry box, a post-it note, a piano melody composed the night before. That became the scenes people still quote 35 years later. The footage sitting in a vault somewhere that shows the darker version of this story, the one where nobody gets rescued and nobody climbs any fire escapes. Pretty Woman is a fairy tale. But the story behind it? That's something far more interesting than any fairy tale. That's what it actually looks like when a film survives everything that tried to stop it, and still, somehow, becomes magic.